She was 30 years old. She was on the cover of Fortune magazine. She was worth $4.5 billion, and every single dollar of it was a lie. This is the story of Elizabeth Holmes, the woman who built the most spectacular financial illusion in Silicon Valley history. And this isn't just a story about fraud. It's a story about how money works, how belief creates billions, and how fast it can all disappear. Stay with me through the end, because the final numbers are going to shock you. Let's go back to where it all started. Washington, D.C., 1984. Elizabeth Holmes is born into a family with old American ambitions. Her father worked for the U.S. Agency for International Development. Her family had historical ties to the Fleischmann yeast fortune. Old money, old connections, old expectations. From the time she was a child, Holmes was obsessed with one idea. She told people around her, repeatedly, that she was going to become a billionaire. Not a doctor, not a scientist, a billionaire. She said it at 9 years old. She kept saying it. By the time she got to Stanford University in 2002 to study chemical engineering, she had already taught herself college-level Mandarin as a teenager. She was disciplined, intense, and burning with impatience. Then came the idea. Holmes had a phobia of needles, genuinely couldn't stand them. And she looked at the blood testing industry and saw an opening the size of a canyon. Every year, hundreds of millions of blood tests were run in America, each one requiring a needle in the arm, a vial of blood, days of waiting, and hundreds of dollars in lab fees. What if you could replace all of that with a single drop of blood from a finger prick? What if one tiny device could run hundreds of tests from that one drop, deliver results in hours, and cost a fraction of the price? It was the kind of idea that sounds insane until you realize what it would be worth if it actually worked. The global blood diagnostics market was worth tens of billions of dollars. Whoever cracked this technology wouldn't just be successful, they'd be transformational. Holmes didn't wait to finish her degree. In 2003, at 19 years old, she withdrew from Stanford and used her tuition savings, money her parents had set aside for her education, to incorporate a company. She named it Theranos, therapy plus diagnosis, compressed into one word, one promise, one bet. She was a college dropout with no product, no revenue, and no proof that her idea could ever work. And she was about to raise more money than most people see in a lifetime. The first check came in June 2004, $500,000 from Draper Fisher Jurvetson, one of Silicon Valley's most respected venture firms. Then $9.1 million in a Series B. Then $28.5 million in a Series C. Then $45 million more in 2010. Each round built on the last. Each round was justified not by working technology, but by the story Holmes told, and by the way she told it. Because here's what everyone who met her said. She didn't pitch like a founder. She preached like a prophet. She spoke slowly, in a deep, deliberate voice. She maintained eye contact with an almost unnerving intensity. She didn't talk about market share or revenue projections. She talked about a child in a rural town who couldn't afford a cancer screening. She talked about soldiers bleeding out on a battlefield who needed instant diagnostics. She talked about changing medicine the way Apple changed communication. And she dressed the part. A black turtleneck every single day, in a deliberate echo of Steve Jobs. At a time when Silicon Valley was desperate for its next visionary, she handed them one, herself. By 2010, Theranos had raised $45 million and was valued at $1 billion. Holmes was 26 years old, but this was still small compared to what was coming. In 2011, Holmes got her most important endorsement yet, George Shultz, former U.S. Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan, one of the most respected figures in American foreign policy, joined the Theranos Board of Directors. This was not a celebrity endorsement. This was a signal to every serious investor in America that this company had been vetted at the highest level. If George Shultz trusted Elizabeth Holmes, who were you to question her? More legends followed. Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State, Nobel Peace Prize winner. James Mattis, 4-star Marine General, later Secretary of Defense. William Perry, former Secretary of Defense. Senator Bill Frist, former Senator Sam Nunn. George Shultz's own grandson Tyler would later join the company as an employee, so complete was the family's belief in Holmes. The board of Theranos didn't look like a startup. It looked like a cabinet meeting, and it functioned as the most expensive, most credible marketing tool in Silicon Valley history. Now the big money started moving. In 2013 and 2014, Theranos raised what became its defining funding round. Hundreds of millions of dollars from names that read like a who's who of American wealth. The Walton family, heirs to the Walmart fortune, $150 million. Rupert Murdoch, the billionaire media mogul who owned Fox News and the Wall Street Journal, $121 million. Betsy DeVos, the Michigan billionaire who would later serve as Secretary of Education under Donald Trump, $100 million. The Cox family, owners of Cox Enterprises, $100 million. The DeVos family invested alongside other ultra-high net worth American dynasties who received the same pitch, the same black turtleneck, the same story about changing medicine forever. In total, Theranos raised approximately $1.3 billion across its entire history. That is not a typo. $1.3 billion. And with that capital came the valuation. By 2014, outside analysts placed the company's value at $9 billion. Some estimates said $10 billion. Elizabeth Holmes owned roughly 50% of the company. 50% of $9 billion is $4.5 billion. Forbes ran the calculation, printed the number, and declared Elizabeth Holmes the youngest self-made female billionaire in American history. $4.5 billion. At 30 years old. Now let's talk about what that money actually paid for. Because while Holmes was telling investors their money was going into revolutionary technology, the reality inside Theranos told a very different story. The company was spending $1 million a month just to rent its Palo Alto headquarters. $1 million, every single month, on office space alone. The conference table in their main meeting room cost $100,000, a single piece of furniture. Holmes received a 6-figure salary as CIO, plus the use of private jets, luxury hotel stays at 5-star properties, and a team of personal assistants paid entirely by the company. Those assistants, according to court documents presented at trial, spent their working hours on personal clothes, shopping for homes, jewelry purchases, home decorating, and grocery runs. Not for the company, for her personally. Holmes traveled with a security detail that cost the company hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. She flew private on routes that commercial flights covered for a few $100s. When she attended conferences, entire floors of hotels were reserved. When she held meetings, the catering alone ran into thousands of dollars per session. At the peak of her wealth, Holmes and her partner William Evans were living at Green Gables, a $135 million estate in Silicon Valley, one of the most expensive private properties in America. Think about that for a moment. A woman whose company had never turned a meaningful profit. A woman whose core technology had never been independently validated. Living in a $135 million home, traveling by private jet, spending investor money on grocery runs and jewelry. All because the number Forbes printed next to her name had 9 zeros after it. And none of it required her to have a single dollar in cash. Because in Silicon Valley, when your company is valued at $9 billion, the doors open, the jets appear, the restaurants know your name, the world performs for you, as long as the story holds. And then, in 2015, the story broke. Wall Street Journal reporter John Carreyrou had been receiving quiet tips for months. A former employee here, an anonymous source there. He started pulling threads, and when he pulled hard enough, the whole tapestry came apart. On October 15, 2015, the Journal published his investigation. The headline, "Hot Startup Theranos Has Struggled with Its Blood Test Technology." The article revealed that the Edison machine, Theranos' proprietary device, could only reliably run a small number of tests. That for most tests, Theranos was secretly using conventional blood testing machines made by other manufacturers. That accuracy results were being manipulated. That patients across America were receiving medical diagnoses based on technology that didn't work. Holmes went on CNBC the same day and called the report factually and scientifically incorrect. She was composed, controlled, convincing, but the investors had read the article. And doubt, once planted in a room full of people who just spent hundreds of millions of dollars, grows fast. Here is something that puts the scale of the deception in perspective. At the time of that Wall Street Journal article, Theranos claimed its Edison device could perform over 200 different blood tests from a single drop. The actual number of tests the device could reliably run, according to regulators and internal documents that later surfaced at trial, was around 12. Not 200, 12. The gap between what was promised and what existed wasn't an exaggeration. It was a different universe entirely. Within months, federal regulators from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services completed their own inspection of Theranos' laboratory. Their findings. The Edison device posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. The company was banned from operating its laboratory, banned from Medicare and Medicaid programs. Holmes herself was personally banned from owning or operating a clinical laboratory. And the lawsuits began. Walgreens, which had installed Theranos testing centers in its pharmacies across America, immediately terminated the partnership and then sued Theranos for $140 million in damages. Money it said it had invested in the partnership based on misrepresentations about the technology. The case was eventually settled for an undisclosed amount believed to be under $30 million. Years later, in September 2023, Walgreens reached a separate $44 million settlement with patients, ordinary Americans who had walked into a pharmacy and trusted a blood test with their health. Safeway, the grocery chain that had quietly invested $350 million in Theranos, $350 million, money used partly to build out in-store clinic spaces that never opened because the technology never worked, also ended its relationship and filed suit. $350 million. Gone. Partner Fund Management, a San Francisco hedge fund that had invested $96.1 million in Theranos, filed a lawsuit accusing the company of fraud through, in their words, a series of lies. That case settled in May 2017 for undisclosed terms, but Partner Fund had made clear it was seeking the full $96.1 million back, plus additional damages. In 2018, the Arizona Attorney General reached a settlement with Theranos requiring the company to pay $4.65 million to refund patients who had paid for blood tests. Tests that regulators determined had produced results so unreliable they should never have been used for any medical decision. Now go back to Forbes. On June 1, 2016, Forbes published a revised estimate of Elizabeth Holmes' net worth. The headline said it all. From $4.5 billion to nothing. Here is the financial mechanics of that headline, because it matters more than most people realize. Holmes' $4.5 billion fortune was never cash. It was equity, shares in a private company priced at whatever the last investor agreed to pay. And those shares were common stock. The investors who wrote the massive checks, Murdoch, the Waltons, DeVos, received preferred stock. Preferred stock means they get paid first in any liquidation or sale. Every dollar they put in comes out before Holmes sees a single cent from her common shares. When the valuation dropped from $9 billion to $800 million, which Forbes used as its revised estimate in 2016, the math destroyed Holmes entirely. $800 million sounds significant until you remember that Theranos had taken in over $700 million in preferred investor capital. Pay those preferred investors first. What's left for the founders' common shares? Essentially nothing. And when Theranos finally dissolved in September 2018, when the company that had been worth $10 billion liquidated its remaining assets to pay creditors, every share, preferred and common alike, became worthless. Total investor losses exceeded $600 million. The Walton family lost most of their $150 million. Murdoch lost most of his $121 million, though his financial team eventually sold his shares back to Theranos for $1 to generate a tax write-off, turning a massive loss into at least a partial financial strategy. $1. That's what $121 million became on paper. Betsy DeVos's family investment group lost over $100 million and later sued to try to recover some of it. In total, across all the lawsuits, settlements, and direct investor losses, the financial wreckage of Theranos represents one of the largest private company fraud collapses in American corporate history. $1.3 billion raised. Over $600 million in confirmed investor losses. Hundreds of millions more tied up in legal battles, settlements, and regulatory penalties. And Elizabeth Holmes? She filed documents with the federal court stating she had no assets. The woman whose fortune Forbes once estimated at $4.5 billion told a judge she could afford to pay $250 a month toward her court-ordered restitution. $250 a month. From $4.5 billion to $250 a month. Let that land for a second. Now came the accountability. In March 2018, the Securities and Exchange Commission charged Holmes and Theranos president Sunny Balwani with securities fraud. Holmes settled the civil charges, paying a $500,000 penalty, returning 18.9 million shares, losing voting control of the company, and accepting a 10-year ban from serving as an officer or director of any public company. But the federal criminal case was different. There is no settling a federal criminal indictment. In June 2018, Holmes and Balwani were indicted on 12 counts of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Both pleaded not guilty. Holmes's criminal trial began in September 2021. For months, a parade of former employees, investors, and medical professionals testified about false claims, manipulated data, and patient harm. Former lab employees described being told not to question results. Scientists described being fired for raising accuracy concerns. Investors described meetings in which Holmes showed them Department of Defense documents suggesting the U.S. military was using Theranos technology on the battlefield. That claim was false. The military had never deployed Theranos technology in any field operation. Then, in a move that stunned legal observers, Holmes took the stand herself. She testified for days. She said she had genuinely believed in the technology. She said she had been working toward a real breakthrough and that the failures were the natural turbulence of innovation. And then she made a claim that shocked the courtroom. She testified that Sunny Balwani had been emotionally and psychologically abusive throughout their relationship, and that his control over her had affected her judgment and her ability to make clear decisions. Balwani denied it through his attorney. On January 3, 2022, the jury delivered its verdict after 7 days of deliberation. Guilty on 4 counts. 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud against investors and 3 counts of wire fraud against investors. She was acquitted on charges related to patient fraud. The jury could not agree on 3 remaining investor counts. At sentencing on November 18, 2022, prosecutors asked for 15 years. They argued Holmes had shown no genuine remorse and had caused devastation to investors and patients alike. They asked for $804 million in restitution. Judge Edward Davila sentenced Elizabeth Holmes to 135 months in federal prison, 11 years and 3 months. He reflected, before delivering the sentence, that her conduct appeared driven in part by what he called her intoxication with fame. She reported to federal prison on May 30, 2023. Sunny Balwani was convicted separately on all 12 counts against him, every single charge. He was sentenced to nearly 13 years in federal prison. The man who had been the operational engine of Theranos, who had enforced the culture of fear and secrecy that kept the fraud running, was going to spend the next decade behind bars. The 2 people who had built Theranos together, in business and in secret, were both going to prison. So what is the actual financial autopsy of this story? Theranos raised $1.3 billion across 275 separate investments over 15 years. At its peak, it was valued at $10 billion. Its founder was worth $4.5 billion on paper. Total confirmed investor losses exceeded $600 million. Regulatory penalties and patient settlements added tens of millions more. Holmes was sentenced to 135 months in federal prison, Balwani to nearly 13 years, and the $4.5 billion fortune that was plastered across magazine covers exists nowhere on Earth. Not in a bank account, not in a trust, not in any investment vehicle that can be traced or taxed or spent. It never really existed. It was a number generated by belief, multiplied by famous names, validated by magazine covers, and sustained by a woman who spoke slowly enough and looked directly enough into the eyes of powerful people that they kept writing $100 million checks long after they should have asked what was actually inside the machine. The paper fortune was $4.5 billion. The real losses were over $600 million. The prison sentence is 11 years. And the question that lingers over all of it, the one that will follow this story for decades, is the same question it always is when something this big falls this far. How did everyone miss it for so long? The answer is one of the most expensive lessons in the history of American finance. In a room full of believers, nobody wants to be the one who asks for proof. Until a reporter does. Until a whistleblower does. Until the truth does. And when the truth finally arrived for Elizabeth Holmes, it didn't knock. It didn't warn her. It didn't give her time to prepare a response or call a lawyer or put on a black turtleneck and face another camera. It arrived the way truth always arrives for people who build their world on lies. All at once, and with everything attached.